Are we on? All right. Colin Plume, CEO, Noble Gold Investments. Excited to have everybody here today on our first live stream. And we'll be getting into a number of topics today, talking about the Trump bump, what's happening with the economy, what's happening with gold, silver, money, the banks, all that kind of good stuff. So we're going to get into a few different things here, and hopefully everybody watching, if you guys have questions, feel free to post those questions, and we'll try to dive in if we have time at the end. But the first thing that we want to get into is dissolving the Federal Reserve, which has been a really, it's been a topic that has come up a lot. Being in the precious metals business, we're sort of the anti-dollar group where, it's not just the dollar, it's just fiat money in general. And the way that fiat money is set up is that it's printed so much that everything that we own, all the dollars in the bank aren't worth as much. So there's been this long running debate about the Federal Reserve and why they're in place. And, I think the important thing before you talk about dissolving the Fed is you really need to think about all the different aspects of first of all, why we even have a Fed, why it was created. And obviously there's a lot of controversy about how it was exactly created. But if you go back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, there was multiple central banks that were run by the government. Now, we're talking about a time where money was actually used, and it's a much different time because things like bank runs were very common. Now, we did see some bank runs last year with Silicon Valley Bank and a few different banks because obviously people were concerned about their funds. But bank runs in the late 1800s, early 1900s were very commonplace because a lot of banks would get in trouble that had currency, actual real currency, and people run to the bank. And so it created a lot of volatility. And so when they created the Federal Reserve, I think the idea was to create a situation where there was some consistency in the monetary policy. And that, plays into how governments work. They want some consistency of how money is set up and money is flowing for different people. Also, it just made it easier to have a party that made some determination. And I think when it started, we were still on the gold standard, and that was the mechanism that still allowed it to have a system that makes most sense for average Americans. Because with a gold standard, a Federal Reserve, and you have those two things in place, it doesn't allow the government to spend out of control. And so you really need those things to have a balance in how our money is set up. But we went off the gold standard. We sort of went off it in 1933, but we really went off it in 1971. And so once we did that, it allowed the government to really expand the money supply. And then fast forward today, we're $35 trillion in debt. And that's why a lot of people believe that we should dissolve the Federal Reserve. And so in theory, on its face, if the Federal Reserve was tied into the government in a better way, in that it didn't allow us to spend so much, I think people would be less fearful, or there'd be less conspiracy theories about what the Fed's doing. The problem is that it seems like they work hand in hand with Congress, and Congress does decide who's in the Federal Reserve, and they do vote on it. A lot of people saw that, Trump he has some issues with Jerome Powell. He wants more control. But ultimately, the way that this system is set up today is that Congress decides who's the head of the Federal Reserve, and they vote for those parties. And he's got it until 2026, Powell, and he said point blank that he's not going anywhere. He's not going to step down from his position. So you have people that are saying we should dissolve it. A lot of libertarians. You have Senator Mike Lee. You have Thomas Massey, Republican, both Republicans, and they're trying to pass bills that were I would say in the vein of Ron Paul. Ron Paul has been one of the most vocal senators he's obviously no longer in office, but he's been pushing this agenda of ending the Fed. He even has a book called End the Fed, which I highly recommend. Easy read, very short book. But the rationale behind ending the Fed on this bill is that they believe that it will create economic stability. The proponents of the bill argue that the Federal Reserve's monetary policies contribute economic instability, inflation, and asset bubbles, which is the exact opposite of why they created it. They created it in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act to create some stability. So they're proposing that it doesn't make sense, that we've created a lot of bubbles. And I think everyone knows that we've seen a tremendous amount of bubbles in the market, especially since 1971. And a lot of those have happened, obviously, since 9/11, in my opinion. And so other things to think about, too, is just the government overreach. The Fed has so much power. The markets are dictated about what the Fed's going to do. So the idea behind moving away from having the Federal Reserve is creating a more free market enterprise and allowing the free market to decide. So that would be the pros. Also, transparency, accountability. There's a lot of things the Fed can do. There's been loans the Fed has done that no one's been able to see, and they say it's for their best interest to keep that private. I don't agree with that. I think anything that's involving my money, I should be able to see. So I agree with a lot of the principles. Now, the things you have to practically think about is then who is in control of our money? Who decides monetary policy if we go away from the Federal Reserve? And this becomes a very difficult point. One way they could do it is they'd have Congress decide. Well, Congress is the one that got us into this problem. They are the ones that have done the overspending. The Federal Reserve hasn't actually done the overspending. It's actually Congress and the government that has created this overspending. So going back to them and letting them dictate monetary policy or how the Fed is handled would create a lot of potential chaos. The other thing too is how do we make it so that the government can't overspend? And that's why a lot of people believe that we should go back to some form of the gold standard. And so maybe it's not completely backed by gold, but maybe partially backed by gold. And what that would do, the positive of that would be, say you back 10% of our currency by gold or 20%. You'd say that, listen, we can't put more currency out there and we can't put more debt out there because we only have a certain amount of gold and we have to back it. And it would create a limit to what the government can do. So those are some of the things that you have to think about when you're doing this. Now, at the beginning, it would create a little bit of chaos to get rid of the Fed because this is the system we've been using for over 100 years. But is the positive of us having some control on what the government can do and the spending, would that outweigh the potential volatility in the short term? And I think a lot of these people would say yes. And I would probably argue yes also. But it's not an easy move to just completely get rid of the Fed. There has to be a good solution. And we have to send a message to the world that we're still the world's reserve currency and we're still the strongest currency. So I think what you'd have to do a big gold buy, maybe even silver, which would make a lot of sense too. And I say that because I think if you did gold and silver, you could potentially sell some of that silver later at a massive profit. My guess, if the U.S. bought gold and silver, gold would go up, I think $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 an ounce. I think silver breaks 100. So I think in the short term, they could take some profits and use that profit to help pay off some of the debt. We saw that similar happen before 1933. It was the government set the price of gold in the low 20s, and then they repriced gold in the low 30s. And it was a massive profit for the U.S. government. So I think they could do something similar to that, where they could reprice it. But ultimately, I think that you have to look at where we would stand as a whole. And I think that the only way we send a message to the world that we're not just drunk on debt is we have to do something drastic. And that's why there's been a lot of talk. And that's why, President-elect Trump has talked about making some changes and having more input with the Fed. But I think you have to have, for this system to work, to make a change, you have to have some underlying asset that people trust. And I think that gold is the asset that you would need to back it by. Because if you think about it, if you go before 1971 and you think about what everyday Americans could buy with their dollar, every person has heard of a story of someone that came back from World War II that worked a normal job, and you had one income, and they had the spouse at home, and they could afford a house. That was a regular story. And that was because we didn't have this unbelievable inflation. People could afford things. So I think going to a gold standard would help that and create that environment again. Now we've just created a system today where you have to go into so much debt to build wealth, and you have to continuously do that. There's no downside to the right type of debt. I'm not talking about credit card debt, but going into debt is really the way that to create a lot of wealth in this country. And I don't think it's the best way to do it. It's created a system where most people aren't able to get ahead and have a normal life. They're always just trying to dig their way out. And so I think creating a gold-backed system again would give more power to the people, and it would take it out of the government and everyone around the government that just profits from this engine. I mean, everybody just, if you look at the GDP, if you look at jobs in this country, so much of them are government jobs, like not jobs that are helping the economy. They're not producing jobs. And so I think that would allow us to create a better system for regular people. And then, going back to saving money again, I mean, now saving money is laughed at, and it shouldn't be that way. You should be able to save money and live, within your means and have some equities and some gold and silver and some real estate and some money in the bank, and you're not frowned upon. And I think today, the way the system is that it doesn't allow anybody to keep any money in cash because the inflation is so high that you're just losing money daily. So the Fed's a big topic. We'll definitely talk about the Fed again and ending the Fed, but there is a big movement now. And I love when a new, president comes in, because there's always new excitement and new ideas that could potentially happen. And we'll see which ones they really focus on. But I think this newfound ideas of Elon Musk saying, like, we don't have to do it the same way anymore. Maybe we can cut some jobs, and maybe we can cut some of the fat. I think is quite exciting. So the Fed, Fairlane, any thoughts on the Fed? Any more comment? How are you feeling about it?
Well, I do have a question. You mentioned that probably shifting to a system where our money is actually hinged on something.
Yes.
Gold, that would still require an agency to run it. So if not the Fed, then who is the best option to do it? Certainly not the president.
It has to be an agency of accountability. That's really what you're asking for, is someone that's accountable to decide how much money could be printed and where interest rates are, because that's, a lot of what's happening. The Fed dictates interest rates. So you have to have some kind of agency. But I think instead of having an agency that is only concerned about inflation and monetary policy, they'd have to have a connection to what our government debt is. And that would be the linchpin, in my opinion, that would create a more stable economy than what we currently have. So you'd have to have some kind of independent agency. I think that, we have a lot of people that in the Fed that are, it's not a connection to the American people. They're analyzing, they're economists, and I understand what they need to do. But ultimately, like, the most important thing is that people every day in this country can afford the increase in price of goods. And I think that we've seen it skyrocket to an unbelievable level. I was just looking at in terms of costs, like our healthcare costs, for instance. For first world countries, we spend more than double per person on healthcare than the top other 40 or 50 countries that are first world. All the European countries. I mean, you can go down the list. With the average American spends, the numbers are about $12,500 on healthcare, where most of the first world is spending between $7,000 and $5,000. A lot of this has to do with just how we've created a system that, the healthcare system has just gone out of control, where they're just charging everyone. Nobody has any idea what these bills are. So we need more accountability. I think you need an accountability group that is really focused on the important issues, which is, keeping healthcare costs at a reasonable rate, keeping the dollar strong, not just deflating the dollar the way that we have, really focus on things that would help everyday people, cost of electricity and cost of goods. These are the things that I think are really more important than just creating this system that really mostly just helps the banks and really just helps the stock market. And, which is, obviously a lot of people profit on that, but it's not everyone's going to be able to profit the way the 1% is, unfortunately.
You mentioned that you feel that it should be handled by another agency. We have Doge to be headed by Elon Musk. The problem, though, is that it's going to be under the executive department, but having our money also under the president, the executive department, is that something that?
I think we have to rename the whole agency onto itself. I think the agency should have some ties to the executive branch, and then I think it should have some ties to other branches, and then ultimately, I think they have to have some autonomy to make some decisions. The problem always runs into if they're beholden to one agency in a certain way, then they won't make the best possible decisions. Similar to like what happens with Supreme Court is that it's once they're on there, they can go ahead and decide and make decisions. The idea is that they're going to make decisions that they believe is the best. Whatever they did before, they're going to make a ruling based on what they see today. I think we have to completely change the system. And that's what, these Republicans are talking about, is getting rid of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And let's be honest, it's outdated. We don't see the bank collapses like we used to. So I think there needs to be more accountability. And I think there has to be a way to have transparency with everything that's happening within that agency, including how much gold we have. Republican Mooney has talked about, like, we need to see how much gold we have. We need to be able to see what the Fed's doing. All they're trying to do is just see what's there. And these are exactly what any business owner wants in their business. They want to be able to see day to day what's flowing in, what's flowing out. Like any profit and loss, it's really important. So it's a big topic. It's a big discussion, but we'll get into it more. There's more ideas to come. I need to formulate more ideas. So over the next few months, we'll come back with some ideas, and I'm sure we'll hear what Musk and some of these brilliant minds are going to come up with, and we can dive into it again. I think the next topic, the two big topics that everybody wanted me to discuss today, is this and tariffs, right? And I think that tariffs are something that has tremendous pros and also short-term tremendous cons. And I think that when you look at what's being proposed by President-elect Trump, we're talking about either a general tariff between 10 and 20% on most imports, 60% tariff on all goods from China, and then maybe a 200% tariff on imported vehicles. And so the idea is that why would you do this? Because the first thing that's going to happen is that the cost of these goods that you're buying are going to go up, right? If you're buying something from China, you're slapping 60% on top. Why would you do that? And the idea is you're raising the government revenue, right? The goal is that you're taking that tax and you're adding it to the government revenue. So that would be the first positive. The second positive was that maybe somebody decides to not buy that from China. So now we're protecting domestic companies. We're giving them a better way to potentially compete against cheap overseas labor. You're reducing some trade deficit. You're creating American jobs. This is the rationale. And I think that the rationale is good. The rationale is good because we do need more growth in this country. And I don't think anybody would argue that we want more jobs and we want more products here. And I think the thing that we learned the most during COVID is that our philosophy of letting everything be made overseas really hurt us because we had a log jam of items that we couldn't get access to. And everybody remembers that. Everybody remembers thinking they're going to run out of toilet paper or sanitizer, right? I mean, all these things were made and those are small examples. I mean, computer chips, they were all made in other places. So, I think that there's going to be, if and when he does move in this direction, because he's talked about this, Trump, there will be short-term, I think it could hurt us in that it'll hurt some economic growth short-term. And that's what most analysts believe out there. Long-term, and it takes a while for these things to kick in. Long-term, increasing jobs and also putting manufacturing jobs back here in the U.S. like we used to have, in the 70s and the 60s and 50s. Maybe we can get back to that economy where, workers in this country, it's easier for them to have one income, afford a home and the normal life that we all want to have. And I think that, there's definitely some tremendous positives if you look at just money in general, having, a parent be at home with the children. There's so many ways that it benefits us as a country. Just in terms of raising better children, having somebody home when the kids are home is great. Childcare costs have skyrocketed in the last 5 years. Anyone that knows that has tried to pay somebody to help pick up their kids after school, the costs have gone up dramatically, where I've known a lot of people where they don't even know if it makes sense for somebody to work anymore. But, one of the parties, it's just gone up so much. So, yes, there is some downside in terms of the cost of the goods that we're buying day to day, the clothes and stuff, but the benefits of having more of that income, more of the increase in job growth, more of the wages, could lead to a lot of positives that are hard to really articulate today because it'll take some time for those things to happen. Also, supply chain, having access to goods that we make and not being so dependent on China and so many countries, there's a positive to that too. So tariffs is a big topic. I think that, and I've said this a lot, I think the big thing is President Trump has made this a very strong point for him. And I think that he sees the longer goal of making more goods here. But there's been no president in the last 30, 40 years that has tackled this in the way that he's tackled it. Every other president has just basically said, let's make things overseas. Let's buy cheap goods. Let's kick the can down the street. Yeah, it hurts our economy long term, but let's just buy cheaper goods. It's great. And he's actually said the opposite, which is quite interesting. From a business point of view, it doesn't really make sense. If you think about it from his point of view, you'd think he'd want cheaper goods, but bigger picture, having more of the workforce working here and growing our GDP internally and becoming more competitive with the world. It's a long-term strategy, but I think it could win and it could be the right one, but it's not going to make things cheaper. It's not in the short term. It's going to make things, there's no way around it. It will make things more expensive, which is a tough pill to swallow also for a lot of people.
So if we do this, if he manages to actually shift to tariff, how long do you think do we have to endure that increase in prices before we start appreciating or feeling the general economic impact of it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends because he has certain tariffs that he's thinking about certain industries, like the 200% tax on auto is basically like in my opinion, and I've seen this with President Trump, he's like, this is the first barrier. This is like, we're negotiating, right? So I'm going to go the most aggressive. 200% is quite a massive number. I don't think it's going to end up there. But what he's saying is that I want auto workers back. I want plants here in the U.S. That's exactly what he's saying. How long that takes it takes a while. It's not going to be easy to move plants back here in the U.S., but he's saying that for a very specific reason, because it does a few things. It creates a situation where you're getting a high-paying job. Like a high-paying auto manufacturing job is exactly the kind of job that you want here in the U.S. It's not a government job. It's a high-paying job because it's a skilled job, and I think that it's very clear that he's looking for a higher wage job, higher wages for revenue for the U.S., higher wages for taxes for us. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that it creates. So he's gonna tackle things that make sense and create better jobs, and getting 5, 10, 20, 50,000 jobs that pay 60,000 to 200,000 is the smartest strategy you could have, and that could happen. It also will help different parts of the country in terms of just home buying and adding revenue to different places and restaurants. People in that make that income, that money trickles down to every city that they're in. That's why everybody wants those kind of plants in their cities. So there's a lot of positives there. So I can't say how long it's going to take, because it really depends which ones he narrows down. But I think that ultimately that's a smart strategy on his part. There's going to be concern with farmers. That's the biggest concern, and we had that before, where farmers are, and that's a touchy subject, because you really don't want to mess with farmers in this country. You really want to make sure that they're protected. We want to make sure we have the majority of the food that we need day to day made here. And I think, he's going directly at China, and I understand why he's doing it, but there's a lot of other countries that are importing goods besides China. I mean, a lot of the clothes that we're all wearing is probably from Vietnam and other places too. So there's other places we need to think about. But yeah, I think that the one thing is that bringing more jobs here, it's a good strategy long term. I think it could work, but I think also keep in mind, cost of items is not going to slow down. And based on multiple experts out there that have looked at the the different styles of plans, the debt isn't going to slow down either. And so more debt, higher cost of goods. How do you, as an investor, or how as you a business person, or how as you as a person day to day, how do you look at that? And you should be looking at the next 3 or 4 years and say, how is that going to affect me personally? And also, how can I take advantage of that? And I think that's going to be really important for people. There are going to be ways, and I think we should, in the next show, we'll talk about some of the industries that we think will be positively and also negatively affected by some of these economic policies that are coming. So I think we hit on some pretty hard topics, tariffs and ending the Fed, and I think these are topics that we'll dive into more. While we're kind of transitioning here, obviously we want to talk about gold and silver, Noble Gold. I brought a little bit of product here for us to kind of look at. These are kilos of silver, really fun. I started buying these really heavy to early pandemic. I'm pretty sure we're in the top 3 or 4 gold dealers in the country in terms of how many we bought and sold of these. We sold a lot of kilo bars. Great way to get a lot of silver in your hands. So silver is
how much is that?
Silver a kilo. It's a good question. I want to say it's probably $1,100, $1,150, somewhere in there, maybe $1,200 today. Quick math, I don't know in my head, but it's worth, I think I paid like $600 or $700 when silver was sitting at $16, $17 range. So silver kilo, great thing to buy. We sell these all the time. This is the great value here. And then I have a 1 ounce gold bar. Has a certificate assay to authenticate. You got to be careful. People always say like, oh, I'll just buy from this place. And there's stories of eBay. There's stories of dealers sending, not the actual product that you're buying. So you really want to be careful on who you're buying this from. But yeah, we sell a ton of these products here. Gold and silver bullion. That's how Noble Gold was sort of built.
It's that small and it's twice the price.
This is, we're looking at gold's the 26. So yeah, this is $2,800 range for this. Yeah, this is gold's up 30% this year. So things have moved a lot, which we'll dive in more into metals and that stuff later. But I wanted to get into some of the big topics. A lot of people have been asking about Trump and what he could be doing. But yeah, this is, it's been great. Hopefully, people that are on enjoyed it. Anyone that's, looking to send in questions, or if you're interested in silver, my silver book, Silver is the New Oil, is coming out. I should have it next week. So if you're interested in learning, getting really in depth into silver, contact Noble Gold Investments, call us. If you want to talk to somebody live, we pride ourselves on actual live customer service. So give us a call, Noble Gold Investments. You want to learn about what we do. We can ship this stuff to your doorstep in a nondescript package. We can store it. We can even roll over an old 401k or an IRA. So if that's something of interest, give us a call, let us know. But yeah, I just want to say thank you and looking forward to diving into some other topics again. Once again,